It's quite busy.
Still got a couple minutes.
Yeah, yeah, no rush. It's not 10:30 yet. So.
Great, Graham. Bristol.
Hey Graham, nice to see you.
You too.
Long time.
That's
Not in Canada.
right.
Oh my God, since I was in the Bangkok.
Yeah,
I'm good. How you doing?
doing okay. Yeah, I'm here until the beginning of March.
All right.
And, so I saw this, the email That's back up.
Is it back up?
Yep.
Oh, back.
I'm gonna give him the one there.
Yep.
About ready? Good. Is the WhatsApp? Is the WhatsApp?
It's like
Chat on.
million.
Is it online yet?
It's on.
Yeah.
It's on.
It's on. Okay.
Oh, so, check. It's on.
Okay. Well. Okay. If everybody can come in and find a seat, we're gonna get started. For those who are still looking for some coffee, I think there's some in the back. Please get your coffee and your tea and come on in and join us. Very good. Good morning and welcome to the Asia Regional launch of Human Rights Watch's World Report 2024, which is covering all the human rights events of 2023 in the region. It's a pleasure to be here with you all in Bangkok at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand, and I want to thank you all for coming today. Both of the folks who have joined us in person here, and as well as the many people who are joining us online. My name is Phil Robertson, and I'm the Deputy Asia Director of Human Rights Watch. And actually, here's the World Report that we're launching this morning as our Asia Regional launch. As you can see, it's a piece of paper. We're making a change from previous years. This year, we actually don't have a printed version of the report to distribute. In the age of global warming, we sympathize with the trees, as well as all of your already overcrowded bookshelves and offices, and decided to only have the report online. But on the back of the paper, you'll see that there's a QR code, which you can use to download the report electronically. And the report is also available by going to our website, www.hrw.org. Human Rights Watch also has a video associated with the global launch, which we'll see in a moment. And we have country-specific releases for many of the over 100 countries that we work in around the world. So if you're interested in what's happening in a particular country in Asia or anywhere in the world, it will be on our website. And we're also distributing copies of an Asia regional press release, which you could have gotten as you came in at the table, as well as a global press release, which was issued when our executive director, Tarana Hassan, formally launched our global report in New York approximately 12 hours ago. So this morning, the way we're going to proceed is first, we're going to see a quick video. Then my colleague Elaine Pearson, who I'll introduce in a moment, will make a statement, and then we'll take questions. So first, let's show the video, which features our executive director, Tarana Hassan, talking about human rights and the world in 2023. So can we show the video, please?
From renewed hostilities between Israel and Hamas to the tremendous suffering of civilians in Sudan, ongoing conflicts in Ukraine, Myanmar, Ethiopia, and the Sahel, and that 2023 was the hottest year on record. Wildfires, drought, and storms affected the lives of millions of people globally. These and many other human rights crises and their consequences are not solvable by governments acting alone. But the international human rights framework, the collection of rules states have agreed upon, provides the roadmap to protect everyone's dignity. We have seen what's possible when people's human rights are respected and protected. In June, following years of civil society pressure, the Japanese parliament passed its first law to protect lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people from unfair discrimination. Brazil's Supreme Court upheld all Indigenous peoples' rights to their traditional lands. The ruling was a huge boost for Indigenous people in their fight to preserve their way of life. Despite the power of human rights to protect everyone's dignity, the system of rules we rely on to deliver on that promise is under threat. Many countries quickly and justifiably condemned the attacks on October 7 by Hamas, but many others have been reserved in responding to the actions by the Israeli government in the collective punishment of civilians in Gaza. Meanwhile, armed conflict in Sudan has led to widespread abuses, but has attracted little international attention, while the people of Sudan continue to pay the highest price. This selective outrage leaves the impression that some lives matter more than others, which undermines faith in the idea that everyone's human rights deserve protection. And when governments ignore their human rights commitments altogether in the name of security or trade, when dealing with autocratic leaders, it can embolden those leaders to extend the reach of their repression. Civil society, courts, and human rights commissions are also increasingly under threat by governments that want to exercise power without constraints. And governments are increasingly using technology platforms to silence and censor critics. These threats underline that governments should urgently respect, protect, and defend human rights to build thriving and inclusive societies. Upholding human rights consistently across the board, no matter who the victims are or where rights violations are being committed, is the only way to build the world we want to live in, where everyone's dignity is respected and protected.
Okay. So now we're going to hear from our main speaker. On my right here, Elaine Pearson, our Asia director, who flew in from Australia earlier this week. Brief introduction, Elaine joined Human Rights Watch in 2007, and prior to her current position, she was Asia Deputy Director and Australia Director for Human Rights Watch. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch, she worked for the United Nations and various non-governmental organizations in Bangkok, Hong Kong, Kathmandu, and London. Elaine has conducted numerous human rights investigations in the Asia-Pacific region and around the world. She's an adjunct lecturer in law at the University of New South Wales and is on the board of the Global Alliance Against Trafficking Women. She holds degrees in law and arts from Murdoch University and obtained her master's degree in public policy from the Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs. She's also the author of a recent book, Chasing Wrongs and Rights, which is described as a human rights travelogue, and that was published by Simon & Schuster in September 2022. So, Elaine, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Phil. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. We are here to launch this report, our World Report 2024, which is a reflection on issues that have happened throughout the last year, 2023. And I think if we think of last year, the lasting memory that's really seared in our brain is the horror of war in the Middle East, both the atrocities by Hamas and other militant groups in Israel, and then subsequently the atrocities by the Israeli government in Gaza since October 7th. But likewise in 2023, although underreported in Western media, we saw wars in Myanmar, Ethiopia, Sudan, and of course also Ukraine, causing immense human suffering. But as our global essay by Tirana Hassan notes, 2023 is also memorable for the way in which governments have responded to those wars and crises, being selective in their outrage and transactional in their diplomacy. That governments display double standards certainly isn't new, but I think in 2023, that hypocrisy was starkly visible, both in the way that Western democracies sought international prosecutions for Russia's abuses in Ukraine, and yet failed to take similar consequential actions on Israel's abuses in Gaza, or the way that Muslim majority countries like Indonesia or Pakistan rallied to condemn Israel's war crimes in Gaza, and yet failed to even acknowledge China's crimes against humanity in Xinjiang. And as for transactional diplomacy, well, how did that play out in this region? Well, I think in this region, we see that many Western governments are so preoccupied with countering the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party that we've seen little appetite to hold human rights abusers responsible if those abusers are seen as strategic allies or trade partners in de-risking, decoupling, or helpful in otherwise containing the rise of China in Asia. And the US is obviously a clear example of this. How else to explain over the past year the very warm welcome for leaders of India, the Philippines, and Vietnam to the White House last year, with barely a word about their problematic human rights records? Transactional diplomacy is really about making calculated decisions to trade away human rights for short-term gains, be they trade, security, or political expediency. But while broadening relationships and partners may be desirable, these double standards and treating human rights as disposable or optional is very problematic. And so what we've seen as a result is this past year, we've seen crackdowns intensify in places like Vietnam against human rights activists, also environmental activists. In the Philippines, we've actually seen the expansion of red tagging of labor activists, basically targeting anyone who is supposedly affiliated or sympathetic to the Communist New People's Army. We've also seen the continued killing of drug suspects. So transactional diplomacy really weakens and undermines global accountability efforts. It also chips away at the effectiveness of institutions like the UN Security Council that are supposedly designed to safeguard global peace and security. Instead, what we really need is a consistent principled approach to hold all governments to the same set of standards. And we'd like to see bolder action of governments working in coalitions to end abuses and speak up whether abuses are committed by friends or foes, strategic allies, or competitors. Now, for this region, 2023 was certainly a year of increasing and intensifying repression from China and North Korea to India and Afghanistan. We certainly saw democratic backsliding. Democracy is under an all-out assault in many places. We saw deeply flawed elections here in Southeast Asia. Here in Thailand, the party that won the most votes was prevented from forming government. Meanwhile, in Cambodia, Hun Sen blocked the main opposition party from even contesting its so-called election. In Bangladesh, just last weekend, the opposition had boycotted the election when it became clear that it wouldn't be remotely credible. And in some countries where they haven't had elections yet, like Indonesia, we also saw a weakening of the institutions that are meant to provide a check on power. Meanwhile, we see that human rights defenders, civil society, and journalists are under siege in so many countries across our region, from Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives to Vietnam, facing harassment, surveillance, intimidation, and prosecution for protest, online activism, and speaking out about government corruption or abuses. Asia has no regional human rights convention or institution to safeguard rights, and the existing sub-regional architecture that does exist, like ASEAN and SAARC, has clearly proven woefully inadequate in addressing regional human rights crises. This is most starkly evident with ASEAN's impotent and ineffective response to Myanmar, which is hardly likely to improve this year now that Laos is the chair. This year, another trend that we've documented is more cases of transnational repression in the region. And, this is a very worrying trend. And I think if governments aren't held to account for serious abuses that occur in their own countries, then they become bolder. And given our interconnected digital world, they try to silence and chill criticism beyond borders. So we saw this where Lao police detained a Chinese human rights lawyer who had fled the country and forced him back to China. We saw Hong Kong authorities using arrest warrants and bounties to silence activists who had already fled the country. A Vietnamese activist was abducted off the streets right here in Bangkok and mysteriously forced back to Vietnam. A female activist from Myanmar was abducted with her entire family in Malaysia, and she still remains missing. And of course, there's India's alleged involvement in the killing of a Sikh activist in Canada and an alleged assassination attempt in the United States. I think transnational repression is not only a worrying trend, but it's also a sign of how weak, insecure, and intolerant governments are, that they can't stand, say, a student from Hong Kong who tweets in a place like Japan or Australia about Hong Kong's democracy, that they literally need to punish people for daring to commit such offences. Finally, on climate, 2023 was the hottest year on record. In this region, we also saw cyclones, intense flooding, fires in parts of Asia. And yet environmental activists in Asia and Australia also face very stiff penalties for protest. And in some cases, they're detained, they're prosecuted. In the Philippines, they've even been killed for their activism. I won't speak to each and every country situation, because obviously we don't have time, but I do just want to say a few words, I guess, on some of the countries in the region before we open for questions. So firstly, China. I mean, in China, we've seen now more than a decade of Xi Jinping's rule, which has been marked by increased social control and increased repression. We've seen, obviously, crimes against humanity in Xinjiang. We've seen severe restrictions on basic freedoms in Tibet, as well as broader cultural assimilation policies and religious repression right across the country to erase any perceived threat to Chinese Communist Party rule, such as distinct religious or cultural identity. In Hong Kong, authorities have wasted no time in applying the national security law. It has a 100% conviction rate. The current trial of publisher and democracy leader Jimmy Lai is really aiming to have a chilling effect, because his case criminalizes all sorts of things that are ordinary and unremarkable in a democracy: meeting foreign politicians, tweeting, writing articles, criticizing the government. Moving on to India, in 2023, Prime Minister Modi basked in the international spotlight, hosting both the G20 and being feted around the world by Western world leaders, embracing him from Australia to France. And many of these leaders ignored India's serious human rights problems, because domestically, we saw the ways in which the BJP government has been intimidating and harassing government critics and journalists. Minorities have also faced hateful, xenophobic campaigns, and there's a real risk of increasing violence in the lead up to elections this May. India also led the world in terms of internet shutdowns, in stark contrast to the image of digital India that Modi tries hard to project. Afghanistan, the Taliban is committing a crime against humanity by persecuting women on the basis of their gender. We saw the ways in which the Taliban continues to deny and exclude women from many forms of employment, education, restricting freedom of movement. The economic and the humanitarian crisis has worsened in the country, and women and girls again are bearing the brunt of this, since they're restricted from livelihoods and they face barriers in getting humanitarian assistance. Compounding these problems, we've also seen Pakistan force back 500,000 Afghans to the country, some of whom were even born in Pakistan. And Western governments have been very slow to process resettlement for Afghan refugees. Moving closer to Thailand, in Myanmar, we saw the ways in which armed conflict intensified in 2023, particularly the fierce fighting towards the end of the year in the northeast of the country, where armed groups wrestled territory from the military. In 2023, we also saw a surge in airstrikes by the military targeting civilians. Human Rights Watch noted the use of a thermobaric weapon in Sagaing region that killed 160 people, and the continued use of cluster munitions, which violate the laws of war, prohibiting indiscriminate attacks. More than 2.3 million people have been displaced internally since the coup. 60,000 have fled to neighboring countries. And for Rohingya who remain in Rakhine State, they continue to live under apartheid conditions. 6 years after the acts of genocide in Rakhine State, the conditions in the camps in Bangladesh for Rohingya who fled are horrific. There are criminal gangs operating. There have been killings, beatings, extortion. To escape these desperate circumstances, boats are once again sailing, often bound for Malaysia. About 1,700 Rohingya men, women, and children have ended up in Aceh, Indonesia, where there has been quite a deliberate toxic hate campaign orchestrated on social media against the Rohingya and against the UN in the lead up to Indonesia's election. People there lack shelter, they're camping in coconut fields or in marquee tents right on the beach. In Thailand, I spoke briefly already about last year's election, but clearly the flawed constitutional and legal framework put in place by the former military-led government has manipulated the democratic process to enable entrenched interests to handpick the Prime Minister. And that's because of changes to the Senate, where a supermajority is now required through unelected senators. Foreign governments last year largely adopted a wait-and-see approach, despite the very clear undermining of the democratic process. Meanwhile, here in Thailand, freedom of expression remains a serious concern. Predominantly youth protesters who took to the streets in 2020 are still being prosecuted under the Emergency Decree, the Computer Crimes Act, sedition, and other laws in an effort to chill freedom of expression and assembly. It was certainly positive here to see laws on enforced disappearances and torture finally pass the parliament, but enforcement will really be key. And on Myanmar, where Thailand shares a border, there has been pushbacks of vulnerable people fleeing the fighting back to Myanmar. And Thailand has also undermined ASEAN's centrality through its own Track 1.5 dialogue involving junta officials. To counter this, concerned governments within ASEAN, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, the Philippines, should be working harder with concerned governments elsewhere for more concerted pressure on Myanmar. Finally, I thought I'd end on some positive developments over the last year, and actually on LGBT rights. This is somewhere where we have seen some progress. As already mentioned in the video, Japan actually enacted its first ever law to prevent unfair discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. And this came after years of campaigning by LGBT and human rights groups. And while it's not enough, it's certainly a start. Here in Thailand, we saw 4 bills pass at the very end of last year, which will pave the way for marriage equality. And if that happens, Thailand would be the first country in Southeast Asia to do so. And over in Nepal, the Supreme Court actually authorized the first same-sex marriage. So certainly that represents some progress where there's been very uneven developments in LGBT rights. And so this is really very significant. Elsewhere, I mean, I've talked a lot about the erasure of democratic institutions, but courts still are providing a necessary check on power and have been doing their job in a range of countries, India, Pakistan, Japan, Australia, in upholding basic rights. But other positive change has been quite spotty and sporadic. It's not really been systematic across the board. And as for elections, I think the fact that most countries at least, still feel that they need to go through the process of having elections, despite all the flaws, shows that they really feel this need to have legitimacy from the people. So much has already been said about the elections to watch this year. Bangladesh, Taiwan will go to the polls tomorrow. We also have Pakistan, Indonesia, South Korea, and India going to the polls. We can talk more about this, although I think it's quite hard to draw commonalities across these countries. And finally, maybe just ending where we started, where we talked about Gaza. We ended this year with South Africa bringing a case before the International Court of Justice alleging Israel's violation of the Genocide Convention. And today there will be more hearings in The Hague on this. And this is progress in using international measures to push for accountability. Countries in this region, like Malaysia and Pakistan, have already voiced their support for the case, and others should do the same. I do want to mention that the precursor for this case was the Gambia bringing the case against Myanmar, also at the International Court of Justice under the Genocide Convention for acts of genocide against the Rohingya. And what we know from that case is that these cases proceed very slowly, but it also shows that the West does not have a monopoly on using international mechanisms for accountability. And we'd like to see more action, not less, by the Global South on human rights in 2024. Finally, established democracies in the region like South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand could be doing more to advance human rights and to show leadership. But I think I'll leave it there because I imagine you all have a lot of questions. And I just want to note that I'm joined, obviously, by Phil, who's extremely knowledgeable about issues across Southeast Asia, also by Bryony Lau, our other Asia Deputy Director, and we have Meenakshi Ganguly joining on the phone to help answer any questions you have.
Great. Thank you for those remarks, Elaine. So now we're going to turn to the question and answer portion of the press conference. And since this is a press conference, we're going to give priority to questions from working journalists. As Elaine mentioned, we have two other Deputy Asia Directors with us. Bryony is over here in the room, and we online by Meenakshi Ganguly, who's responsible for our work in South Asia. For those who are tuning in remotely, either via Zoom or by the Human Rights Watch YouTube account or the FCCT's Facebook live stream, you can type your questions into the chat boxes on those platforms. If you do so, we request that you include your name and your organizational affiliation. We have a team that are monitoring those chat boxes who will relay the questions to me up here. And again, the same rules apply that since this is a press conference, we'll give priority to online questions from members of the media. Obviously, we'll try to get to as many questions as we can in the time we have allocated for this press conference, but after the press conference is over, we'll stick around for any one-on-one questions or interviews that you want to do with Elaine, me, or others. So first question, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi.
And introduce yourself and where you're from.
Marwan Mark of Nikkei Asia. Elaine, good to see you back in Bangkok. You touched upon transnational repression, and you highlighted just one example of what happened in Laos, where a Chinese lawyer was picked up and sent back to Beijing. But just within mainland Southeast Asia, are there other examples of Chinese flexing their muscle and getting not just human rights lawyers, but say even Uyghurs and the others who the Chinese state considers national security threats, with the assistance of their allies in Southeast Asia to be taken back to Beijing? Thanks.
Yeah, maybe I'll start and then I'm happy to pass over to you, Phil, on that. Yes, I mean, there have been numerous instances. I mean, we have Uyghurs who are in detention here in Thailand who've been languishing in detention for years because of pressure from the Chinese government to return them. And we have had cases in the past where Uyghurs have been returned. We also know that it's very difficult for activists from China, from Tibet, to speak out openly about issues across Southeast Asia. We've seen growing influence and economic interests by the Chinese government right across the region. And before Christmas, I was just in Indonesia, where we were talking a lot about what is happening in China. And many of the journalists that we had met had been to China, had been on basically these tours of certain areas that had been handpicked by the CCP in order to try and present an image that everything's fine in Xinjiang. They didn't get to visit the political re-education camps or speak to individuals apart from those that were handpicked by the Chinese government. So I think actually there's a lot more work to do here in Southeast Asia about these cases of transnational repression, but also really digging into the ways in which the Chinese government has established influence here.
Yeah. I would just add, of course, there was the very prominent case of the 109 men and boys, the Uyghurs who were sent back in 2015 to China. Many of you may have seen the actual video that appeared on CCTV, the Chinese state broadcaster, where you had these men hooded on a plane. Each of them had a policeman in uniform next to them. They were taken back to China and disappeared. We've not been able to track what happened to them. That was 109 people. We've had other cases. We had two Chinese, Han Chinese nationals here, Don Guangping and Jiang Yifei, who were posed to resettle to Canada just days away from going to Canada and were sent back by the previous Thai government, the NCPO. to China. So, I mean, there's certainly a number of cases where China has demanded and received support, particularly from the previous Thai government, for that. I think that there's also other places where certainly there's pressure being applied to countries to comply with China's demands to return people in what are clearly instances of transnational repression. I know very clearly, for instance, in Malaysia, where a number of Uyghurs have escaped from Thailand and ended up in Malaysia, there was active efforts by the Chinese government to demand that the Malaysian government find these people and send them back. So, China is extremely aggressive, and it is actively pursuing a policy of transnational repression against people who are activist dissidents and ethnic minorities who face persecution, who have fled the country and are trying to get to a safe place. It's a major problem. It's something that the international community has to do something about. China can't be allowed to play by a different set of rules than everybody else. Please.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Phil. Hello, Ms. Pearson. My name is Imtiaz Maqbul. I'm the executive editor of Travel Impact Newswire. I haven't had a chance to read the report yet, but I had two questions. One is the role of multinational corporations and how much pressure they're exerting on the political parties and the increasing nexus between the political parties and the multinational corporations. And we are seeing increasing evidence of that, particularly in places like India, which you mentioned several times, and where there's a clear nexus between the Adani Group and the BJP party and the entire funding apparatus. But this is on a global level. We've also seen where many individuals are now coming out publicly with pressure on universities to skew their agendas towards their own political views. We have seen again, you mentioned the Hague issue, but there are a lot of stuff that is done with what happened in Harvard recently. The second question is on your own operations, Human Rights Watch. I'd be very keen to know how much pressure you yourselves are under as probably one of the last of the Mohicans trying to preserve this whole issue. But how is it affecting your own funding, your own operations, and where do you see that going forward? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, I mean, I think the role of corporations and business, I mean, we haven't spoken about it much here, but I think in nearly every chapter of the World Report, each country chapter, we do talk about the ways in which businesses are also responsible for the violation of human rights and their responsibilities. And particularly, we've had quite a focus on social media companies, which now wield a huge amount of power, particularly in their ability to censor and select or prioritize certain content through the algorithms. And so this is an area where we're doing, an increasing amount of work, particularly in the tech space. We have a whole business and human rights economic justice division, which is really about holding companies to account for human rights abuses. And it works, in a range of different areas from, looking at industries where workers are having their labor rights violated, to also sectors like mining, where there's environmental destruction and inadequate support to the communities that are bearing the brunt of that destruction. On the university sector, we've actually done a lot of work on academic freedom issues. So for instance, in Australia, we did a report that looked at Chinese government interference and the extent to which academics and students were self-censoring in the classroom because they were so afraid of surveillance, intimidation, and harassment from other students who often would threaten them with being reported to the Chinese embassy if they dared to speak up on Hong Kong or Tibet or Xinjiang. And the last of the Mohicans, I've never heard Human Rights Watch referred to quite that way. I like it. But yeah, I think civil society is really under assault right now. And, I started working for Human Rights Watch 15 years ago. And in that time in Asia, I've just seen so many of the countries where we used to have people on the ground, boots on the ground. It's becoming harder and harder for us to do that. We don't have access anymore to Myanmar. We've never had access to North Korea, China, Hong Kong, Afghanistan. So the list of countries is growing we continue to document human rights violations in those countries. So we've become more savvy in doing open source investigations and finding other ways of investigating these abuses. Because also what we've seen over the last 15 years is huge technological advances, and actually, many places where human rights atrocities or massacres may have once occurred without people really knowing about it. Often now people actually have a digital camera, a mobile phone, and so that is a treasure trove. It's a gold mine of information. But we are under threat and under siege, and I think that's why it's so important that civil society organizations, media organizations, and governments that profess to care about human rights really push back on the ways in which our rights are being constricted all across this region.
Let me just add one or two things there. Business and human rights has now become very popular in Asia. There's a lot of governments who now want to create national action plans. So Thailand has now 2 national action plans on business and human rights. Malaysia's doing one, Japan has done one, Vietnam is doing one. They all want to do a national action plan. Unfortunately, a lot of times you get the national action plan and then you have inaction. Nothing happens afterwards. We actually are joined today by Oi Chutima Siddhasathian, who's a human rights defender, who's now facing 9 criminal defamation charges for work she's doing, trying to represent villagers in Korat province connected to a bank and malfeasance about loans. And, the National Action Plan of Thailand said that they were going to take action against these strategic litigation against public participation lawsuits, but very little has actually happened from the Thai government. So, it's popular to talk about business and human rights, in part, I think, because the governments can say, well, geez, it's not us violating the rights, it's these businesses. But the reality is the governments have the responsibility to ensure businesses comply with human rights obligations. And they're not doing it. So, that's a problem. Question in the back. Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Mira Kim, born in North Korea. I mean, long time ago. But I was brought up in Seoul and having been living here in Thailand over a century. By the way, I just wondered, what have been achieved to improve human rights in North Korea last year by Human Rights Watch? Thank you.
North Korea.
Thank you for the question. I mean, clearly not enough. No, I mean, I think in North Korea, we've actually seen ever since COVID in 2020, increasing isolation, increasing repression. Last year, a number of laws were passed, which actually even criminalize things like the use of South Korean words, language, vocab, and foreign influence. And there have been prosecutions under these laws, and people have been sentenced to forced labor. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the Commission of Inquiry into North Korea, and that was really a groundbreaking report, which really put on the map the human rights violations that are faced in North Korea. But if we look at what's happened in the past decade, we haven't seen progress on the ground in North Korea. And so, I think we really need to take stock of these last 10 years and think about how we can use international pressure to ensure that when North Korea comes up at the Security Council, it's not just discussions about the threat posed by nuclear weapons, but that human rights are also front and center of those discussions.
Okay. We're starting to get some questions online as well, so I'm going to take one of those and then we'll go back to some in-person questions. We have a question from Yeshi Dawa of the Radio Free Asia Tibetan Service from Dharamsala. Question: how is Xi Jinping's Sinization policies undermining the human rights of Tibetans in Tibet? For instance, the removal of the Tibetan language as a teaching medium and use of Mandarin. Only colonial-style boarding schools where over 1 million Tibetan children are being forced to study in.
Yeah, well, we are seeing these policies of signification of religion, for instance, really trying to erase religious identity in places like Tibet and Xinjiang. We've documented very severe religious repression there for many years, restrictions on freedom of expression. I would say the one bit of bright news that we had, just last week is that the US company Thermo Fisher is no longer going to be supplying its DNA technology to the police in Tibet. And this comes years after Human Rights Watch first exposed the way in which police in Tibet were collecting DNA material from Tibetans without their consent. Now, this clearly isn't enough. This has come late, and we would like to see the same approach applied right across China, because these abuses are not just happening in Tibet, they're happening right across the country. But I guess this just gives you a sense of the ways in which, when it's not possible to really sort of hold the Chinese government to account directly, using, I guess, the ways in which foreign companies that are active in China is sometimes an effective way to get them to change their behavior in order to improve human rights for ordinary people inside the country.
Elaine, please.
Unusual to have another Elaine in the room. every time Phil says your name, I feel like jumping. Elaine Kurtenbach, Associated Press. I was going to ask about the use of Chinese developed surveillance equipment around the region, and if you're seeing trends with that. The other question I had was more generally, are there any parts of the world where you see any trends toward improvement in protection of human rights? Thanks very much.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just taking the issue about Chinese technology and equipment, yes. I mean, many cities are using the sort of smart cities surveillance technology, Chinese developed, cameras and surveillance equipment. This is happening in Southeast Asia. This is also happening in places like Egypt, also in Latin America. And it's something that we are, concerned about. And then we've been talking about how we can work with other civil society organizations to document some of these practices, because we are seeing the ways in which the Chinese government is able to export its model of repression through exporting this sort of equipment. In terms of, I guess, the positive or bright spots, I guess, for human rights, I mean, I think the ways in which, despite all of the challenges that human rights defenders and civil society organizations are pushing back and continue to do so, despite the very real risks of imprisonment, of harassment, of intimidation, I think provides a very positive lesson to all of us. And I think, it's also about standing in solidarity with individuals, whether it's, women who still are taking to the streets to protest the abuses by the Taliban in Afghanistan, or indeed, whether it's protests more locally here or in places like Myanmar, but they deserve solidarity and support. And I think, certainly what we want to see is better coordination between different countries in order to get effective change. So, it's no longer possible to rely on a handful of powerful countries to push for change. We want to see a coalition of governments around the world, different countries working together to push for positive change.
Yeah, I was going to add that on that theme of solidarity, people always ask me like, well, your job must be so difficult. The governments hate you. They're always giving you a hard time. But when you talk to the people who are actually victims of human rights abuses, who we're working with and helping, like the woman that we met in Indonesia last month, who has been protesting every Thursday in Jakarta since 1998 when her son was killed. She is well known, but, us standing in solidarity with her means a lot to her and a lot to the people who are working with her and helping her and supporting her. I think there's a sort of dimension of humanity here that sometimes gets lost in these discussions, that we're really talking about people and their rights. And when people face difficulties and problems and persecution, who do they turn to? We try to be there and help as much as we can. And of course, there's many other human rights organizations that do so as well. But, you know, that part of solidarity can never be underestimated in terms of how important it is. It's important for the people that we work with, the people that are in the region. You know, ASEAN keeps saying it's about the people of ASEAN, but for ASEAN, it's always about the governments. But for civil society, for people like us, it's about the people. And that's why we do it. You know, when we look at issues of like surveillance, for instance, you know, there's the massive surveillance that's now coming up in Myanmar, where there have been the use of these Chinese technologies to monitor what people are doing, to try to identify, for instance, who are the peaceful civil, the CDM protesters, you know, who are trying to organize peaceful resistance against the government there. You know, this is the sort of thing where, you know, those people are turning to us and asking, well, what do you know about these technologies? How we can find out more? How can we avoid some of these technologies being able to track who we are? And the pressure that, for instance, Elaine mentioned about the company, the American company that was working hand in glove with the Chinese police in Tibet. You know, we played a role in pressuring them to finally stop. You know, and that's being done because it matters to those people. I think we have some more questions online. We have something from BFM Radio in Malaysia, which said very clearly, okay, how does the report take into account the impact of climate change in respect to human rights? So a very broad question about something that we're increasingly focused on.
Yeah, so I mean, I think on climate change, Human Rights Watch's approach has been particularly looking at the ways in which certain groups, marginalized groups, may be more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So we've done that work, particularly looking at the impacts of flooding in places like Bangladesh and Australia, and how that has impacted certain communities, older people, people with disabilities, people who might not necessarily be able to act on, you know, warnings that are simply sent, you know, through mobile phones, or who might have mobility issues, and the ways in which that, you know, the plans that governments put in place address those issues. We've also been doing a lot of work, particularly around fossil fuel companies and their responsibilities, and we will continue to do a lot of that work, you know, really targeting, I guess, where where that work is coming from. We put out a report on the Maldives just a couple of months ago, just before COP, which also looked at the way in which the government was continuing to issue authorizations for land reclamation projects, particularly for tourist sites, which was having a very negative impact on the environment. So a lot of the work has also focused on the way in which governments are sometimes bypassing the regulations or the laws that exist that are meant to protect and defend the environment, but are doing so because, you know, there are, you know, powerful interests, vested interests, or companies that are pushing this through. And we continue to do a lot of work. I think I mentioned this in my earlier remarks on the situation of environmental defenders who've come under attack. Vietnam is one place where, yeah, we've seen increasing prosecutions, actually, of environmental defenders and activists, despite the fact that, you know, governments like the US and Australia are trying to partner with Vietnam on, you know, a just transition. So there's a whole range of issues, I guess, that we're focused on, with reference to climate. I also wanted to, I don't know, Bryony or Meenakshi, if you want to come in on any of the questions, but, you know, feel free to intervene.
Right here. Stay right here.
Maybe to just build on Elaine's points about Vietnam, and we also see continued attempts by the Philippine government to target environmental activists there, including abductions and killings, as Elaine mentioned. But I think on environmental issues, there's also some positive highlights that we can mention too. One thing that we've been following very closely is new legislation in the EU, in particular the deforestation regulation, which really subjects supply chains that affect a number of goods across the region to much closer scrutiny for human rights abuses. And so particularly relevant here, are things like palm oil, with Malaysia and Indonesia, of course, being major suppliers to the world economy, as well as minerals that are required for the so-called just transition. So for example, nickel mining in Indonesia, as well as in the Philippines. So there are, in general, I think the picture is a bit mixed, where on the one hand, we see some negative trends in Asia, but on the other hand, we're also seeing new tools coming about as a result of new legislation elsewhere in the world that will affect practices in Asia.
Please go ahead.
Dominic Fulder, Nikkei Asia. I wanted to ask you a question about double standards. We perceive Human Rights Watch to be a US-based organization, and it seems to be having rather a lot of problems with human rights at the moment. It's also involved with developments around the world. For example, the situation in Afghanistan might not be so bad if the retreat had been better organized. The situation in Gaza is extremely controversial. It's possibly jeopardizing Biden's re-election potential. So basically, what's going on, and what's your budget for North America?
Yeah, I mean, actually, the largest country program that we have at Human Rights Watch is actually our US program, which is dedicated to documenting human rights violations in the United States. We issue a lot of reports focusing on issues internally in the country, this past year on migrant issues, on racial discrimination, but also looking at foreign policy issues. And so, you mentioned Afghanistan, and we've done reports particularly on the ways in which, the US and other forces have been responsible for very serious abuses during the time that the US was in Afghanistan. And absolutely, I mean, I mentioned it in my opening remarks, but I think it is really important that governments like the US are held to the same standards as any other country, particularly when, a country like the US, has so much clout and power. And, I think that's really at the heart of the essay by Tirana, looking at double standards and looking at the ways in which governments are sort of selectively choosing the countries or the issues that they're outraged about, and then taking certain actions to defend certain interests. But then in other cases, the response is notably different.
Okay, we have a question from Axel Kronholm, who's a correspondent for Swedish Broadcasting Radio. Can you say something about rights for indigenous people across Southeast Asia and the Pacific? Any trends or developments you would like to highlight?
Yeah, I mean, as an Australian, I think a real low point for us in the region was the voice referendum, which failed in Australia. And I think, this was really disappointing to Indigenous Australians who, really wanted to have at least a starting point to address, the many years of discrimination that they have faced for so many years. Across the region, in terms of Indigenous issues, I mean, we've been doing work also in the Philippines, I guess, particularly looking at the way that Indigenous groups that have been trying to advocate for certain rights have been marginalized, have been harassed, have been intimidated, and sometimes have not been fairly compensated. Also, when there have been mining concessions taken on their land. We have a report coming out later this year, which will focus on West Papua in Indonesia, and particularly the systemic racism that West Papuans face, and also the knock-on effect this has had for continuing human rights abuses, which go on without a lot of international attention, precisely because international organizations and foreign journalists do not have access to that part of Indonesia. So, much of our work does touch on Indigenous issues. We already, spoke previously a bit about some of the concerns in Tibet about cultural erasure and forced assimilation and language issues. I think these issues really touch across the board.
Have other questions in the room? I have questions online, but I want to also give opportunity for people who have actually turned out to be able to ask questions. If not, I'm going to continue with the list here, but if you are interested in asking a question, please do head to the mic. So we have an issue from Brian Yong from Echo Business Singapore. He said, focusing on Thailand's LGBT progress, Human Rights Watch commented that Thailand's implementation of the Gender Equality Act 2015 was piecemeal. How do you see this lagging progress and enforcement affect the progress on LGBT rights despite the country's progress to pass marriage equality laws?
Do you want to take that one? please?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think everybody who lives in Thailand understands there's a bit of a yawning gap between what the law says and what the laws require and what actually gets done on the ground. And I think part of that failure enforcement, I think, is a recognition that there's been weaknesses in the diligence with which the Thai government enforces that the Anti-Discrimination Act and elements of that. That said, I think that there is very real progress taking place on the marriage equality laws. From what we understand, as Elaine mentioned, there have been 4 laws passed in the first reading of the Parliament. There has now been constituted a committee to take those 4 laws and try to bring them into one final version. That is being done by a committee that also includes representatives of the LGBT community. So it is being done in an inclusive way that people are at the table who are having their say and they're from the community. The hope is obviously that that law will pass in the next couple months through the second and third readings. We are, however, quite concerned that the Thai Senate, which is composed of appointees by the NCPO past government, who are primarily conservative and fairly retrograde in some ways, may cause some problems for that draft law. Obviously, we would urge the Thai Senate to not do that and to not stand in the way of human rights progress for LGBT persons in Thailand, and for Thailand to be able to very quickly fulfill the promise that the Thai government has said that it wants, that they want to pass an LGBT marriage equality law in time for Pride Day later this year, and that they want to, in fact, host the global Pride events in the coming years. If Thailand makes that important step, we obviously hope that other countries in the region will follow. Southeast Asia has lagged behind other parts of the world in addressing the rights of LGBT persons. And actually, if you look at globally in terms of what would constitute human rights progress, if you look at the rights of LGBT persons, that's one of the areas where we've seen some of the greatest progress in the last 20 years. So it's time for Asia to catch up, and it's time for these rights to be respected. Okay. I'm going to bundle a few questions here that we've received. All right, so we have a question about increasing transnational repression against activists in Indonesia under international anti-terrorism cooperation. This is from Rafendi Dajimin from the Human Rights Resource Center for ASEAN. He says, Thailand, Indonesia are championing ASEAN, promoting torture-free ASEAN through ICHR, supposedly respect the non-refoulement principle. How would HRW respond to government claims on anti-terrorism cooperation as a pretext for this transnational repression?
Thanks, Rafendi, for the question. I mean, I think a lot of this comes down to the definition of terrorism and how terrorism is being defined. And I think this is problematic because we see some governments with very vague, overly broad counterterrorism laws that criminalize all sorts of peaceful conduct. So even where you have, for instance, Hong Kong's national security law, criminalizing all sorts of things that, are quite normal in a democracy. So, for instance, they have provisions around collusion with foreign forces, and the evidence that's being produced is things like contacting, MPs in different countries, having a meeting with a foreign minister in another country. So I think a lot of it actually comes down to like the definition of terrorism and being very clear about actions to counter terrorism should be actions to counter violent activity or attempted violent activity, and that it shouldn't be about suppressing peaceful criticism.
Okay, we have a question from the ILO about protection of journalists. According to IFJ, the International Federation for Journalists, in 2023 alone, 102 journalists were killed in respect to reporting role. Elaine mentioned briefly that Human Rights Watch is working on social media. My questions is, what measures and actions are being taken to provide better protection for the human rights of journalists? If they do not raise human rights issues, no one in the world will pay attention or take action for human rights and labor rights.
What do you take that one?
Okay. You know, we work very closely with journalists, and I think that, you know, sitting here at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand, you know, the FCCT has been very active and also playing a role in defending the rights of journalists. And Human Rights Watch has actually joined hands with the FCCT, with the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University and the Taiwan Foreign Correspondents Club to take on the Human Rights Press Awards. This is a set of awards that were previously administered by the Foreign Correspondent Club of Hong Kong until that became no longer possible. And then it was brought out to the Southeast Asia region. We're actually in the middle of a process where people are submitting various different pieces that journalists have done to those awards. And the idea is that those awards recognize journalists for undertaking and reporting in an innovative and effective way on human rights, because reporting on human rights for a journalist can be dangerous. We recognize that. And you know, we have, for instance, in the Philippines, one of the deadliest countries in the world for journalists, where, you know, journalists are continually killed in an astonishing rate. So the rights and protecting the rights of journalists is really fundamental to what we are about. And I think that much more needs to be done. I think there is an alliance of various different press clubs, organizations, human rights groups, groups defending rights around the region that needs to step up and do more. But I think that it's not only the journalists themselves, but also we're also seeing some of these citizen journalists who are also being targeted. I think that this is a longer term project. I think that certainly the ILO has a role to play, but also so does UNESCO, which has the operational role in protecting journalism and freedom of expression for journalists as part of the UN system. So we're going to continue to do more on that, and I thank you for the question. I think we've got one more question in the back, and I think we're going to wrap up because we've run on quite some time, but please go ahead, introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Dewi. I'm from Rapid Asia in Bangkok. Actually, my question is related to the journalists, but it's more specific in Palestine or in Gaza, because as you said, the previous question about the 100 of journalists killed, I just want to ask about the Human Rights Watch. Do you do the specific investigation on that? Because I think many people say that this is intended, you know, they kill the journalists. So because they're the one, because there is no international journalist can enter. So there's all the information about the situation, about the fact on in Gaza is come from the Palestine journalists in the field. So I wonder, is in the report there is specific mention, specific topic related this killing of journalists. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we are very concerned about that. I'm the Asia director, so I'm not as closely following our work on Gaza, but I know that we have released some materials where we have talked about, I think there was a particular attack in Lebanon where the evidence that was presented to Human Rights Watch was that those journalists were specifically targeted. And, you know, this is extremely worrying and extremely concerning. And obviously that has been happening in Gaza as well. We usually would have a staff member based in Gaza. She just happened to be out of the country at the time that October 7th happened. But, you know, we've been in touch with a lot of people on the ground in order to document and verify exactly what is taking place. And, you know, certainly there's been a lot of media reporting. I mean, I saw just, you know, in the last few days about an Al Jazeera journalist also. But this is something that we're working on. I'd be happy to share with you some of the materials that my colleagues in the Middle East division have prepared on that.
Okay. We have actually one last question. In the report, Malaysia scored low in 7 areas, including freedom of speech and expression, refugees, asylum seekers and migrants, criminal justice system, freedom of religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, women's rights, environmental, indigenous people's rights. What are the improvements that you would suggest in order to improve the human rights situation in Malaysia? So I was going to ask my colleague to come up and say a few words on that one.
Thanks, Phil. I mean, I think Malaysia is another example of a country where we currently have in power a government for whom we had high hopes that they would be able to improve the situation. Of course, it was historic when Anwar Ibrahim became the prime minister. However, a lot of the campaign promises that were made by him have not been fulfilled in practice. I mean, as the chapter mentions, there has been some progress, namely the removal of the death penalty as a sentencing option for some crimes. However, it remains in place for drug charges, which we remain very concerned about, and we advocate for the abolition of the death penalty entirely. In addition to that, I mean, we have seen some verbal commitments towards removing unaccompanied children from detention, but Malaysia's continued use of immigration detention, which is indefinite and arbitrary, is really appalling. And we have a report coming out about that in February. In addition to that, in the past, we've issued 2 reports on freedom of expression in Malaysia, and the government has so far failed to remove legislation and to amend legislation that has really cramped the ability of Malaysians to exercise their freedom of expression in Malaysia. In addition to that, one last thing to mention is that although we have talked about LGBT rights in some parts of the region as a bright spot in 2023, that's certainly not the case in Malaysia, where Anwar himself has sort of washed his hands of the matter and has said that he's not going to really work on this issue, despite the fact that we have documented in the past continued discrimination that is supported and enabled by the government targeting the LGBT community.
Thank you, Bryony. Okay, well, let me thank you all very much for coming to our Asia regional launch of the World Report. As you know, you can get all the materials about the report, associated press releases about various different countries. That's all online at hrw.org. Elaine and I and Bryony are going to be here to answer any further questions you may have after the press conference. But again, thank you for your interest and your time, and thank you for everything you do to help promote human rights in the region.
Thank you.